Hi there and welcome. This call is going to be focused on a quick recap of where we are. Um, I will, before starting the call formally, just show the antitrust policy notice. We show this at the beginning of every meeting. You'll find the full antitrust policy on the Linux Foundation website. Now, our regular agenda is pretty light. We cover some news, we work on the standards, we go to any other business, and we close the meeting. This particular call may be shorter than usual because what we're going to do is look at the news, and then when it comes to working on the standards, instead of focusing on line-by-line editing, we're going to take a look at the current situation, where we are with our existing standards, where we are with our proposals, and what will happen next. But let's dive straight into the news first. And really, there's only one important thing to take away as we enter Q4, and that's that we now have a formal publication slot of early November, as communicated by our mentors in JTC1 at the ISO organization. That means we expect our security assurance standard to move from being our draft international standard, a de facto industry standard, into a formal ISO standard in early November. And that will mean that instead of referring to it as an ISO DIS standard, or instead of calling it a de facto industry standard, we will call it a formal ISO standard. We expect the final ISO standard to have this designation, 18974:2023, to indicate the year of publication. In the long term, if we update the standard, then that year of update would iterate the number, say 2027. People could continue to use the old version, and the way that the standards are tagged with the date allows that to be easily controlled in the supply chain. Now, if you're one of the organizations that are adopting our security standard in the past or adopting it right now, don't worry. Self-certification to the OpenChain security assurance spec, or the same thing then named as a draft international standard for ISO, will always remain free, and it is always going to be functionally identical to the ISO standard. You will therefore be able to download the standard and self-certify to it on our website at any time. Just for your reference, on the main ISO website, when the security standard is published, you will have the option to download it on the front page of ISO, and that's a paid option, but you can also download it from the DIS, Draft International Standard section of ISO. And sorry, my apologies. It's midnight here in Japan and my brain isn't working. You can download it from the PAS, publicly available specification section of the ISO website. And that means that in effect, then you can get the ISO standard for free from ISO on their PAS page. You can buy it on the normal ISO storefront. You can get the standard for free on our website, and you can self-certify for free. It's exactly the same situation as it was with our license compliance standard, ISO IEC 5230. So that's good news. And the fact that our ISO publication is taking place in November is a little slower than we'd expected, because it seems they had a bit of a publication queue in ISO. But it is mapping nicely to the fact that we passed our ballot. We did all our edits in July. We knew that we were just in the publication block. We had companies announcing their adoption of the standard, like BlackBerry, LG Electronics, and now, of course, we'll have the formal publication of the ISO version of the standard very shortly. I just wanted to pause here and check if there's any questions about that publication process or accessing the standard or self-certification. Okay, if there's no questions about that, just to reiterate, this is exactly the same type of access and self-certification as we have with our licensing spec. And indeed, it's the same type of access as you'll see in sister projects like SPDX. So with this in mind, let's jump into our little recap of where we are with working on our standards. Now, we're coming back after a little bit of a break. We last had a meeting at the beginning of September, and since that meeting, there's been quite a lot happening. We've had the opportunity to have an OpenChain governing board meeting, and there is now a scheduled steering committee meeting coming up. What that means is that it's the perfect time to recap where we are and what happens next. So let's talk about it. Where we are today is that we have various proposals for updating existing standards and creating new standards. That's a lot of ideas. And the way this project works is that the ideas are filtered through our steering committee. The community works on proposals for updated standards or new standards. Those proposals are finished as draft specifications. And then the steering committee, consisting of our governing board and the chairs of our specification work group, that's Chris Wood and Helio over at Cariad. Chris is at Lockheed. The chairs and the governing board meet, they look at the draft proposals and they vote on A, do the proposals go through? B, do the proposals require further work? C, should they be something else as opposed to a new specification? Or D, are they rejected? In other words, the steering committee is the formal guidance on where we go next. Now we have quite the pipeline of stuff to work on. We have the next generation of license compliance, so that's ISO 5230. We have the next generation of security assurance, that's ISO 18974. And yes, I'm aware that that standard is just being published. I'll explain why we're working on the next generation in just a minute. We have a proposal for a new contribution process management specification. And we have a proposal for telco SBOM quality specification. So two new proposals for specifications and two existing standards with proposals for update. All of this stuff will go before the steering committee for first review in early December. So we have about 2 months to work on these items before they get their first review by the steering committee. Don't worry, that doesn't mean we have to finish everything. What it means is we have until that length of time to decide to put, let's say, these two in front of the steering committee or all of them to say if we think a proposal is ready or not. And of course, the steering committee at its discretion will look at everything anyway. It's just a question of whether on our side, on the community drafting side, do we think something is finished? To recap again, why we're doing this, the license compliance spec was last updated in 2019. It became an ISO standard in 2020. So its formal name is this. And since that time, of course, people have had ideas and suggestions to improve it. Most of those ideas and suggestions are focused on clarity and ensuring that the intent of the specification is expressed as accurately as possible. It's a pretty normal cycle. And as a rule of thumb, people prefer their ISO standards not to get updated too often. So once every 5 years or so seems like a reasonable window. And as we hit year 3 end for this standard, it's a good time to be proposing a draft of its future. And we've been working on that. In case you're new to this call, we've been working on that for about a year now. The security standard, which is just about to be published with this name, is already looking at having a draft proposal for update. Now, the reason is pretty simple. First of all, the big picture is security is a fast-moving field. There's a lot going on, and there's all kinds of new requirements popping up. So there's the real possibility that this ISO standard in this fast-moving field will need to iterate more often than once every 5 years or so. Being more granular, when we were preparing this for the ISO version for submission, we sent it to ISO Working Group Subcommittee 27, Information Technology Security. And they came back with some editorial comments, but also some scope comments. And those scope comments, obviously, we weren't going to re-edit our existing completed draft spec. We put them into a second generation. But that meant we had some really good scope comments right away, even as the first generation was going through. So in the case of the security assurance, the second generation would be focused on looking at, do we expand scope, plus how do we improve language based on feedback so far. Bear in mind that even though the ISO standard is only being published in November, we actually locked down this document in December last year. So we've had almost a year of feedback coming in, some of it from ISO, some of it from individual contributors, and so on. So plenty to think about. Though there's no reason to believe that we'll be iterating this ISO standard immediately, there is reason to believe that this next generation work is important. And just like license compliance, we've actually been working on this since the minute we submitted the first generation to ISO. So we've already gone the best part of a year into looking at that. I'll cover that in a minute. Very recently, we had a blue sky discussion. Would it be useful to have a contribution process management spec? This came from a suggestion by our chair, Jimmy Alberg from Ericsson. He's the chair of the governing board. And he was thinking, in our ISO standard 5230, we have section 3.5 that says, if you're going to contribute to open source projects, have a policy. And there it stops. And Jimmy suggested that perhaps we should look at having some more guidance on corporate process management around contribution. For example, apart from just having a policy, what else might you need in place? Well, perhaps you'd need some processes, some named personnel responsible for the activity, and so on. So it's a blue sky discussion. It's a new idea. And this draft, this suggestion is being worked on GitHub, and it will be something that goes before the steering committee in December for their opinions. Some people will like it, some people will not. And this is why we have a proposal process. Likewise, over in our telco work group, they were doing a lot of work about, in the telecommunications industry, how do we determine what is a quality SBOM? Not about formats, more about what type of things do we need to see in an SBOM for it to be quality. Now, in their case, they decided to use a combination of some of the key fields in SPDX plus the NTIA minimum requirements to create this SBOM quality assessment spec. And after completing their draft, they looked at it and thought, well, gosh, maybe this can apply to every industry. So starting this month, we're going to move the discussion about the telco SBOM spec into our mainstream global channel. There'll be a kickoff call, and that will allow us to look at the way that they were determining SBOM quality with fields from SPDX and the NTIA minimum requirements, and for us to assess whether their approach is suitable for determining SBOM quality. Is it also suitable for people using other formats, other SBOMs? What adjustments might be needed? And do we want to put it before the steering committee as a formal proposal for a new standard? Now, does this mean that OpenChain will be throwing new standards randomly at the wall? No, of course not. Our vision is of a trusted supply chain where various types of compliance information, now that could be license compliance, it could be security compliance, where compliance information is reliable, reputable, and repeatable. So our vision then is a trusted supply chain with solid compliance management as it pertains to open source. As we work on each proposal, we have to decide, does that map to our vision and mission or not? If it does, then it's a suitable proposal for the steering committee, and they will use the same lens to judge it. If it's something else, if it belongs elsewhere or it doesn't belong in our remit, we have options. We can turn it into a guide, we can give it to an adjacent project, etc., etc. The main challenge is that we have to work on this stuff. And like I said, we've got about 2 months before the steering committee formally looks at all of the fun and games that we've been having in the community process and gives us some formal guidance on where to go next. Okay, that was a lot of talking on my side. So what I'm going to do now is to narrow down more specifically what we're doing. Okay, so OpenChain has 2 standards. Okay, we have 2 specifications in market. I just put them into the meeting chat. One is a license specification. It's an OpenChain standard, and it's also an ISO standard. The other is the security specification. It's an OpenChain standard. It's also becoming an ISO standard in early next month. The rest of the stuff we have are only proposals. They're not ready for use. They're not OpenChain standards, just to be super clear. But we are working on next generation versions of our licensing and security spec. Just putting that here. I'm going to skip this item on the contribution because that's in another page. We'll come to that in a minute. My apologies. So we're working on the next generation versions of licensing and security. Chris Wood has been leading the security side discussion, and it's been a stellar job. Lots and lots of sensible edits going on there. Helio leading on the licensing side, and likewise, lots of really good edits. The most interesting thing is that we're cross-pollinating between licensing and security. If a term or condition that is present in one spec changes, then we update it in the other spec as well. This makes sure that we are creating a coherent family. These are sister standards. They're not intended to be different documents. At this point in time, we have no plan to make very different standards. We created security because people were using licensing for security, and we could make a fork and create this sister standard easily. At this juncture, there's no reason to believe that future proposed standards would deviate from this sister standard concept. And the advantage is that if you adopt the licensing spec, it's not a huge step to adopt the security spec, or vice versa. All right, so with licensing and security, specifically, we have a bunch of open issues. And that can show you what we have yet to do. We'll close as many of those as we can before the steering committee meets in early December. And anything that isn't closed in the draft proposal will go into the next round of editing, whether it's on the same proposed update or it's a future generation of the standard. Now we also have the proposal for a contribution specification, and that is here. This proposal is not an existing standard, and all the material you find around it, all the material on GitHub, is currently in flux. It's based on a blue sky discussion. But the question at play is, would a contribution specification assist companies in managing their open source compliance, managing their open source approach to third-party IP, and so on? Or would it not? Open for debate. It's on GitHub. And also, and I really, really stress that this is a blue sky draft. This is very important, so don't expect it to be coherent, but also you can check out a notepad effectively. This is a link in the chat, a notepad of hacking around the document based on our existing format used in licensing and security. Is that material intended to be an end product? No. Is it intended to be adopted? Absolutely not. We are blue sky discussion of a proposal, but the proposal is underway. We've had our kickoff call, and we will be editing this document, making this proposal in these calls moving forward. Now, a little bit different is that the telco group have already created a pretty complete proposal for a new specification, but they started thinking that it was for telco alone. And now they realize that it could be cross-industry applicable. And we're kicking it over here into the main editing track. We'll have a kickoff call this month to formally say we're now looking at this spec. And just like the contribution proposal, this is a proposal. This is not a release document. It's not a new standard. It's a proposed spec. And therefore, we'll look at it, we'll edit it, and we will put it before the steering committee if we think it is looking good for our mission of improving trust in the supply chain, getting better compliance information out there. Now that's a lot of notes and a lot of links that went into the chat, but I wanted to give you proper context of where we're at. And this is timely because we're not the only ones working hard on new standards and new generations. I notice we've got Gary O'Neill on the call, which is great. And I'll just flag that SPDX is about to release SPDX 3.0. It's a huge generational update to the SPDX specification for dealing with software bill of materials. And SPDX 3.0 is opening up an entirely new vista for how we manage things like SBOMs. Instead of being something relatively monolithic, it's moving into profiles. And in the third generation of SPDX, in the first iteration, you'll be seeing things like licensing, compliance, and AI. And in that generation moving forward, I think 3.0 is about to release, and work is already beginning on what will happen next, 3.1, that will include stuff like a services profile addressing how cloud services can be described in your SBOM. I'm just going to, Gary, if it's okay, I'll just ask you, is there any update on when 3.0 is coming out, or how do we jump into the 3.1 editing process?
Yeah, so everybody is welcome to contribute to SPDX. I'll answer your second question first. We have meetings, actually we have our regular technical meetings immediately following this meeting every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And I'll post the link to the GitHub repo that contains the spec that you can review, comment on. We manage the issues through the GitHub issues, and there's a contributing file that explains the process for that. On today's call, we're hoping to close one of the last remaining issues for the release candidate 2. We've already done a release candidate 1 that's been out there for a while. And the intention for release candidate 1 was to get the tool developers started writing tooling for the SPDX 3.0. We've taken that learning into account and made some changes for the release candidate 2. So depending on how the meeting goes, we should be within a couple of weeks of release candidate 2 that will support a serialization specification that will be released along with that. And I would expect one more release candidate after that. I have a feeling we're going to learn something from the serialization spec release that might do one more turn. So we're probably looking at 2 or 3 months of remaining work. And then once we're done with the spec, just like OpenChain, we'll be taking it through the ISO process, which does take a little bit of time. And in addition, we're also taking it through object management group OMG process. So it'll also be an OMG standard in addition to an ISO standard. So, but that'll mostly be done after we feel we've completed the majority of the work on the spec. Sorry, Shane. A very long answer to
No, no,
a
it's a perfect
straightforward question.
it's a perfect answer. And this, I mean, because this is such a large change, it's something that's very worthwhile for people looking at. These new profiles provide a lot of potential utility, and to see that in 3.1, we're already seeing new proposals like the services profile is very important. Just for people who aren't super familiar with the links to follow, in the chat, you'll find a link to the main SPDX website, but you'll also find a link to the minutes from the general meeting that I found in one of the SPDX invites, so you can catch up on the progress of what's happening there. And, you know, with the work going on, and Gary, correct me if I'm wrong. Oh, cool. That's brilliant. Gary's just posted the repo where the SPDX3 work is being done. So people can jump right in and see the work as it happens. With the outcome of this new standard, you can probably get an awful lot of interesting information about thinking around SBOMs. So just opening the website, you'll see the profiles for SPDX3 here. So security, licensing, AI, data, and build. And yeah, because it's a sister project, sister ISO standard, and it's also iterating right now, it's a very interesting time. So for clarity then, the OpenChain security standard is coming out as an ISO publication in November. And we have the draft future licensing and security specs going before the steering committee at the end of this year. But their timeline, if we update our existing ISO standards at the earliest, would be somewhere around mid to late 2024, which means that we're likely, if we do an update on either of those, we're likely to be entering a similar window to the updated SPDX ISO standard as well. So we'll be coordinating closely with them and asking them to keep us appraised of all the exciting developments. Now, for those of you who are wondering what's the main difference between the OpenChain standards and the SPDX standard, it's that OpenChain is process management. Okay, so OpenChain is supply chain focused process management. And basically the first thing we do is say, have an SBOM somewhere, but we don't say anything else beyond that. And as people go down the layer in fidelity of, okay, now I know roughly what I'm doing, I'm having a process, what do I do? Then they find a choice like SPDX, okay, that can be my choice of SBOM, and I begin implementing here. And as Gary mentioned at one of our very recent meetings, then you go further down, you're looking at, okay, so I'm implementing the SBOM, how do I automate? And there's various tools that support SBOMs like SPDX. And the SPDX project has its own tools available and tools in its ecosystem. You'll find here. So just so you know, that's how it works. It's a pyramid. And our part in the pyramid is to get people onboarded with business process management. And the fidelity increases from there. All right, that's been a lot of discussion about context. Does anyone have any questions at this juncture or any comments? All right, if there's no questions or comments right now, and don't worry, you can either have them on this call later, or you can bring them up on the mailing list or open issues on GitHub. What I'd like to do is just bring Chris in, our co-chair of SPEC, and just ask Chris a question. Chris, I'm thinking, how about we start editing in earnest on the next call? That'll be the mid-October call, and perhaps we go through the existing open issues on security, as well as having a deeper dive on telco and contribution. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great idea.
And just spitball, you've got a lot of experience in standards. I was wondering what type of update cycle do you think is most comfortable for people in the supply chain? Or, do you have any opinion on that?
Really, I think that for just to not overwhelm either side of the coin, from my work with IEEE and with the ISO folks, is that it's probably better to, when something important is changing in either in industry or in regulations that would affect our existing specs, I think would be a real good time, just to keep them current and fresh, and put new ideas in maybe once a year. Uh, send a proposal for an update if there's really something that's fresh and new that you can add to it. But I think people get burned out having to go out because a lot of the companies have to purchase these. And so buying a new specification every year and replacing what they've got might be a little onerous for some of the smaller companies.
Of course. And, this is also an interesting point about processes. For example, I mentioned that it's possible to download the equivalent of the ISO standard via our website, or you can go to a pass page on the ISO website and download our standards. But if you go to the general ISO main site, you go into the purchasing workflow and you buy it for 130 francs. And for a lot of companies, just as a side note, their processes would say, here's how you get an ISO standard, and they send you to the storefront, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So we have to take into account the fact that processes aren't ad hoc in a lot of companies, and we don't want to put burdens of time or money on them unnecessarily. A great point, Chris.
And I think that's a little bit complicated because a lot of, especially industrial and software manufacturing type sites, use a lot of different specs besides just our open source OpenChain specs. So they're also going to be getting the ISO specs, and if they're signed up with one of the ANSI standards or something like that, then they're going to be picking up those standards as well. So it gets to be a larger management issue for industry than it does for us particularly.
And of course, we want to be very cautious as well. For instance, I was just in Germany, and we had companies like Mercedes and Siemens on stage talking about how they manage open source, and they were all referencing OpenChain 5230.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a lot of success in getting into the market. Companies like PwC have already committed support, not just their existing support to 5230, but support to ISO 18974. So PwC, Deloitte are gearing up to put that support in place for the ISO standard, which is great. But it's also a responsibility for us then not to overwhelm, as Chris said, the supply chain. It can take a long time for this stuff to move outward. On the bright side, and here's the really cool thing, Chris, and I know you mentioned this before, Nicole, standards don't go off. They don't go too stale. So our job in refreshing the standard is to keep it market current. But if we have the steering committee say, look, you're working on a good idea, but we'd like to tweak it this way or that way, and we run longer on updates, we're still updating, for want of a better word, a product for market that will be very useful. So, we balance making sure that our standards are fresh with the fact that our work to refresh them will still be fresh and useful in 6 months as opposed to today. So that when we go before the steering committee, if they have questions, comments, changes, we don't have to panic that we failed in our mission. Our mission is to get those proposals done, make them as good as we can, take them to the steering committee for assessment, and then go back into a feedback cycle as necessary. All of the hard work is recorded, documented. You're all going to get your credit for it. And our balance here is that we're not going to move fast and break things. We're going to make sure these ISO standards are rock solid, and that the update cycle feels comfortable as well. Just pausing to see if anyone has any comments or questions at this moment. Okay. In that case, I have one more thing I just wanted to throw by you, Chris. And based on your experience in standards committees, I think it'd be fair to say that discussions can have quite a few people for and against proposals. So it's nothing new. And therefore, perhaps one thing we can encourage our community is on GitHub, to speak up if they like or dislike something. If you dislike the ideas that we're putting into, let's say, the next generation of license compliance, if there's something you don't like, say it clearly, open an issue about it. If there's something about contribution or SBOM quality you don't like, say it loudly. And if you do like it, say it loudly, because we have to look at the different opinions to get a real temperature of where the market need is. Do you think that's a fair assessment, Chris?
Yes, I really do, and I've got a good example. The IEEE folks here in the U.S. decided that it would be a good idea to do a open source software governance overarching specification. So they started working on one, and when I heard that they were working on it, I jumped in to see how I could help. And I think that there were several other people who belonged to other foundations, like the Apache and maybe Eclipse. And they were also working on things. And so there was quite a bit of conversation within the development team within IEEE about which direction to go in, and should we do this and should we do that, and is the open source community really going to buy into this because it was not developed in an open, transparent manner as far as contributions go. And so in the end result was that I started the conversation going to should we look at maybe withdrawing our proposal for a formal ISO spec on the formal side and go to a more open and transparent development methodology where outsiders could feel free to come in and see where we were and make contributions. And then it was up to the team to decide how to incorporate them, but at least people from the outside of the team would have a voice in what the eventual spec said, which would make it more useful to them.
That's
it.
That's a really good point. This is the modern tension, right? We're the opposite in that we have this community process and everyone can dial in and edit. And then we narrow it down with the steering committee, as opposed to the traditional committees and so on, which were more closed. So it's very interesting how we borrow from each other the best practices and knowledge of our different communities. And Chris, I'm glad we had that example, that case study.
Yeah. So from IEEE has what they call the SA forum, which is a open collaborative that anybody can join, anybody can make contributions, suggest contributions, and then it will be discussed, and the contributor will get a voice in the discussion. So I think it'll be a better way to do it. And I think Josh just made a comment in there about considering making point releases, and I think that's a great idea.
Yes, and we've discussed that a little bit before, but Josh, do you want to expand on your suggestions so we can discuss further?
Yeah, sure. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like if the work is already being done to maintain the OpenChain standards on the OpenChain site, that if you have a predictable release cadence for the major versions and submit those as the ISO standards, big companies will be able to plan for that. And then if you use the point releases to update the standard for the people that are, interested in contributing and they want to keep it fresh, and like they want to use the new hotness, and they're also trying things out, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and then you can align those releases up with the steering committee meetings. So if you want to do 2 a year, so you would kind of couch it as, all right, we're going to start work on 3.1, and this is the stuff we want to try out, and then at the steering committee in December, we'll present the 0.1 candidate, and then they'll give it the thumbs up for the 3.1 release, and then you'll start 3.2, et cetera, and you'll build that up, and then if you have a predictable cycle of 5-ish years for an update to the standard, that gives all the bigger players, slower movers, time to see what's coming through the the point releases, and yeah, that's so kind of like a operating system LTS cycle, is kind of what I had in mind when I was thinking this.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a very valid point. And what I'll do is briefly just give you some background on the historical discussion. So we're going back now a long time. In the 2016-2017 period, the discussion was that the standard was pretty young. So 1.0 came out in 2016. And there was a discussion and a decision to iterate relatively quickly. I believe it was every 6 months. Was it? Yes, it was 6 months between 1.0 and then 1.1. And then it was a year between 1.1 and 1.2. So in the early stage, there was a decision to iterate quickly as a de facto standard to get it polished. But then the decision after that was to submit it to ISO and to basically then not release any new versions for a long time. And the rule of thumb that was put in place, and this isn't a policy, it's just a rule of thumb, a discussion from that window. So now we're looking at the time scale of 2018 going into 2019, was that people probably don't want to see ISO standards updated too often. I'd say especially in our specific domain, business process management, because it's so slow and expensive to change business processes. So for that reason, we decided to work on drafting the next generation of the spec, taking comments, but have no particular goal to release an update for around 5 years. And that's what takes us to today with licensing, where we're now in year 3, and we're producing a draft to go before the steering committee, which would go into their hands for formal decision. Do they like it? Would they want that as the next standard or not? Do they want changes, etc.? But we also now have proposals for the security standard, which is an ISO standard, but it's got tons of scope suggestions that came in quickly from ISO itself, Working Group Subcommittee 27. And we have proposals for new specs that would touch different types of business process management. So how do we manage all this stuff? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, we've got a few SPDX people on the line. The way SPDX manages it is by basically having de facto standards as different versions of the standard, iterating upwards, and then larger point releases as ISO standards. And that's how they're managing a relatively rapid development cycle. I noticed Chris was muted, but sorry, Gary was unmuted, so I just was pausing there. Chris,
yep, I'm agreeing with you, Shane. That's how we're doing it.
Okay, good. Kate is someone who's been involved in SPDX since the very beginning. Day one, I think, pretty much.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, Chris, over to you. I just took us to where we currently are, and I was going to end with the fact that So now we probably have to noodle on a suggestion to the steering committee of what might be the best way forward. Do we want point releases, but iteration in between, or do we just want freeze, long edit period freeze? Chris, over to you.
Yeah, the one thing that I was thinking about is I think that the current thinking that you were just talking about is probably a good idea, unless changes in the environment, say for example, something with quantum computers that comes up that all of a sudden we've got to address rather quickly in the software assurance, for example, specification with work group 27.
Right.
We might want to consider doing a more formal release after due consideration instead of just doing a point release, just so that people know for a fact that, hey, there's something important in here. But I think for just freshening and updates and small changes, point releases work great. That's it.
No, it's a good point, Chris. And maybe then we can try to take this all together, and this dovetails with something else. We can take this all together and say maybe we can make some notes to the steering committee about how we can have the formal releases, but perhaps on something fast moving like the security spec, we could have updates, small iterations available more frequently, given that it's a fast moving marketplace. So that's something we can put before them. And it dovetails with a discussion that the board had, and that'll be coming to the community. The board was saying that as the project has matured, and we have a pretty strong process for proposing, editing, developing specs and taking them to steering committee, but we're doing a lot of stuff, other stuff too. So maybe we need to enhance our processes a little. Maybe we need to have more guidance on the update cycles, how to do those. Do we have a policy against point releases and then major updates? Tie it up a bit, make it clear. So making a proposal for that would be very useful for the governing board. And they're likely to also provide us more guidance on things like, well, there are proposals coming in for entirely new standards. At the moment, our process is that people can make a proposal and there can be a kickoff call and that proposal can be edited. But do we need to tie that down a little bit to prevent our project becoming overwhelmed with proposals? Do we need a stronger framework for how something gets to a kickoff call? So that's also something the steering committee will be considering in December. In other words, Chris, maybe one thing we can do in our call in 2 weeks is continue noodling on this idea of potential official guidance on, minor updates versus updates that get turned into ISO standards. And do we do it at all? If so, what cadence?
Yep, I agree. Is Helio on the call today, or?
No, he's not. But this
Okay.
particular call is at a horrific time, I think, for many people finishing up in Europe. Though it's not as horrific as Asia, where it's now 1 a.m.
Yes, sir. I hear you.
Yeah.
And you're sounding remarkably cogent.
It's pure acting, I assure you.
All right, I'll let you go. Go ahead.
Okay, so what we've got then is, Josh tabled that we have a look again at the way we update the standards. We have some feedback on how SPDX manages that. So we'll work on that on the next call. We have the proposals for license compliance, security assurance updates, new spec proposals in contribution and SBOM quality. We will work on security, SBOM quality, and contribution on the next call. And we'll try to get as much done as possible before the steering committee meets in December on these items, because the steering committee might be working on increased guidance on how we make proposals for new standards, et cetera, et cetera. I would ask that at the moment we have no more proposals. We're doing a lot. Let's not do more. And of course, we have now the ISO standard for security graduating from de facto to formal standard in approximately 30 days. So we'll also have, I think, a burst of work around that as people look at it, they come to our community, and then they get excited because they can already share ideas about the future, which is one reason I said that we should look at that at the next call. So we're well prepped with our current state. And that's where we're at. Does anyone have any comments or questions? All right. So this call was an assessment call, looking at the current status, how we got here and where we're going next. And we've had some great feedback and suggestions. So we will use this call and the recording of it to help guide the spec work group. And starting next call, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of a proposal for update cadence to make this more structured. And we will also work on the actual proposal, security, SBOM quality assessment, and contribution. We're now moving into the final section of the call. Any other business, you can raise anything you want as a participant in the OpenChain community at this section, though you're not obliged to. And if there's nothing being raised, then we will proceed to the close of the meeting. Everyone, thank you very much for being part of this recap of our status. We took a small hiatus there in the second half of September. So because of that, and because we had the board meeting, it was a good time to recap. And it was fantastic to have you present, to have your support and your ideas. Don't forget, this call is a milestone in how we look at this stuff, but most of our work takes place on GitHub. So go there, go have a look at the links in the meeting chat. If you want to dive in, open issues and comments on updates to the existing standards or proposals for new standards. Take care, everyone. Have a beautiful day, and I'm looking forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you, Shane. Appreciate you staying up late to do this.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.